4 major pipeline projects, billions on the table, and yet we've mostly failed. Today, we're asking, why does Canada keep losing the pipeline wars?
And more importantly, can it change? With a new PM, new priorities, and new political pressures, is there actually a path forward?
The Discourse starts right now with Cheryl Oates and Erika Barudis.
Welcome back to The Discourse. Today, we're talking pipeline politics, why Canada has struggled so hard, what lessons have been learned, and whether the current political and economic context make building national infrastructure more feasible.
And later on the show, we have a guest who deeply understands the energy sector and international trade, former Deputy Minister for International and Intergovernmental Relations, as well as the former CEO of Canadian Energy Regulator, Gitane De Silva.
So to kick things off, all the premiers across the country seem to be getting along since the First Minister's meeting, but the devil will be in the details of their consensus on the proposal for a corridor to Tidewater. The premiers came away from their meeting earlier this month with this novel consensus. There's rarely consensus at these meetings of a route from Prince Rupert, BC to Churchill, Manitoba. But awkwardly, given that one of the ends of this corridor is in his province, Premier David Eby was not at the First Minister's meeting because he was on a trade mission to Asia during the time. And he came back from his trade mission and has now been the first to burst Alberta's bitumen bubble by saying, not really, not super pumped about a heavy oil pipeline to Prince Rupert. But that's not exactly what he said. He said he's focused on existing proponents.
It's not my job to come in and tell Premier Smith that her vision for a North Coast pipeline is many, many years off, and there's no proponent at this point. My job is to ensure that British Columbians' interests are protected and promoted. And one of those ways that we're doing that is driving forward shovel-ready projects.
But with the exception of Premier Eby, it feels like all of the lefties are now pro-pipeline, Cheryl, especially Premier of Alberta, Wab Kinew. They're all jumping on the 2019 Jason Kenney slogan, jobs, economy, pipeline. So my question for you is this huge shift back to being pro-energy and pro-pipelines, is it because of tariffs or the fact that Justin Trudeau put our economy in the dumps that everyone is looking at pipelines for a solution? And also, I think everyone's using, instead of pro-pipelines, for those listening, I'm doing quotations, economic corridors. Is that also from the left a political way to soften being pro-pipeline?
So a couple things. One,
really loaded that.
I think it's really easy to be supportive of a pipeline that doesn't actually go through your province. So let's take half the country out if we're talking about this particular corridor. David Eby has a lot at stake in BC, and this isn't the only, a pipeline to Prince Rupert is not the only thing on the table. So does he just say blanket yes, build baby build? Is that palatable for his population, for the people that are voting for him? Or does he take a more thoughtful approach? And in this case, I think it's not that he's anti-pipeline, it's that he's taking a more thoughtful approach. And on the corridor question, I don't think this is because pipeline language is difficult for progressive governments. I think it's because we're actually talking about more than pipelines. We're talking about energy transmission, we're talking about critical minerals, we're talking about roads, we're talking about natural gas. It's more than just oil, and it's more than just pipelines. And so I think when you're talking to a broad population, and especially when you're talking to a place that deeply, deeply cares about its coast and its environmental protection, it's important to talk about all of those things because they all carry diverse economic benefits.
And do you think that, there's always this balance, and I think all parties are looking at it the same of energy versus environment. Is it easier pill to swallow as maybe a more progressive of because you always hear the heavier support for LNG of conventional energy versus bitumen? Is that also the way we've shifted to talk more about LNG that makes it softer to politically digest?
Well, for British Columbia, there's just more benefit in LNG. BC doesn't have these massive oil reserves, they have massive natural gas reserves. And so the idea that you could, export liquefied natural gas off the coast, the predicted bump, even in their current fiscal outlook, is pretty consequential. And so it makes sense that Alberta, the BC is more interested in natural gas. Also, like we just finished a Trans Mountain expansion. They just committed to dredging to allow more tanker capacity coming out of Trans Mountain. So like, I think they're just looking at a diversified, that's why LNG and natural gas are so attractive to the BC government at the moment, because they have sort of like an environmental plan built around them, environmental precedents built around them. And also it's just so helpful. It's necessary for their bottom line.
So where do you think this is going to go? I mean, there's lots of governments traveling to each other's provinces, having these discussions. Lots of them are behind the scenes. We have the G7 coming up. Like, this is going to be like drill, baby, drill is going to be the topic of conversation, I think, for our unforeseeable future. What do you think EB's next move is then? And is it like trying to be part of this team pro Canadian energy conversation? Or do you think he's going to be the first to like go rogue from our Kumbaya First Ministers meeting?
Well, he's already kind of the first one to sort of put his foot down and say, like, I'm not just going to sign on to an energy corridor that, you know, ends in my province, that ends on my coast. But I think that he's like, I mean, there's been this massive shift, not just in BC, but across Canada. Obviously, BC had a close election. And so you've seen some shift politically since that, but also since we've had Trump's inauguration, and there is more of a focus on economic and energy security in Canada. The population's interest in that has changed, and so there's much more room for politicians to have this conversation. And I think EB is pretty actively engaged in that conversation. Like, I don't think he's going to say, like, you know, no more pipelines, keep it in the ground, like, you know, I'm not interested. I think he's just going to be really strategic about what's in the interest of his own province, as all of the premiers are.
Interesting. Actually, like, sometimes I don't even remember that Wab Kinew is NDP, but he did, like, he is pro Churchill. He is pro railway, pro everything, like, to export there, which I know is actually, like, kind of industry wise less appealing just because of the temperature and icebreakers and things like that would have to be put into place. But he did come out too that was like, I'm calling on corporations to bring it forward.
Yeah.
So what do you think his like play is there? And is he looking for government support? I mean, the Prairies all kind of said we need infrastructure support from the federal government too. So how do you think he's playing this? Because it's just different than most NDP.
He's basically saying, like, I call on the private sector to come do this because we can't do it without you. And that's kind of what David Eby said too. Like, he, in his clip there, you heard him say, like, I'm not going to be the one to tell Danielle Smith there's no one waiting in the wings to build this project. But that's the same problem that Wab Kinew has, is who, like, great idea, but who wants to build it?
Yeah. I mean, and again, coming back maybe to this like economic corridor versus that, like, from your conversations, I mean, you're more connected to those two governments, obviously, than I am. I got my Sasky people, but what does an economic corridor really look like? Are we talking rail, roads, broadband? Like, what are we putting
like, hopefully
into
everything? Like, hopefully everything.
That's all you got? Like,
yeah,
I mean,
a
solution to my question.
I mean, like, yes.
What would you advise them? What would you advise them?
I think we're talking about everything right now, and I think that's what Mark Carney is interested in too. Like he can't just be the pipeline prime minister. Like, if he wants to get big things done, he's talked about one Canadian economy. If you want to do that, you need big national infrastructures to make it happen. And he's the guy that says he's going to get it done, get it approved in 2 years. So it can't just be for the benefit of one province. Like, Mark Carney needs to prove himself across the country.
Yeah, I'm actually interested to ask Gitane about that. Like, this, you know, what needs to happen? Is it even feasible to do 2 years for this project? What kind of environment? And then, like, do we have people ready to step up to the plate, or like corporations wanting more from government to make this a business plan? Like, I just don't know how the path forward works and where everyone is going to be smiling about it.
Okay, well, let's get to it. Joining us now is someone who's actually been in the room where it all happens. Gitane De Silva, former Alberta Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Relations and former CEO of the Canada Energy Regulator. Gitane, thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Maybe we can just start with what's being proposed today, because new Prime Minister, are we still calling him new? Prime Minister Mark Carney has some really, really big ideas about how he can get big projects, assuming that includes pipelines, approved within 2 years, which is a lot shorter than pipelines are currently approved if they are approved in Canada. You've worked on the inside in many different ways. Is this even realistic?
Yeah, absolutely. If you move, just by moving the political decision point up much earlier in the process, you have the ability to shave off months, right? Because you will give industry certainty that they'll know a straight up, down, yes or no if their project will go ahead. And then the debate shifts, as has been said, about how to build it as opposed to whether to build it. So that's going to save you a whole bunch of time. I think even bringing first ministers together to have this conversation so you can get some degree of alignment, because yes, you need industry proponents, but you also need governments on board if you're going to get big projects built. So I think, it will be possible if we want it to be possible, right? If there's a will, there's a way. And so I think this realization that we need to build out our infrastructure of all kinds to expand our markets, diversify our markets, I think, yes, we can get it done. Maybe not as quick as we would like, but certainly quicker than it's happening now. And any progress will be good progress.
But this is it's not just months. We're not talking about months shaving off. We're talking about like having the time in some cases, or more than having the time. 2 years seems really quick. Would it take legislation to make this happen, do you think? Or would it take more than political will? Would we need something else to really push projects forward?
Well, the question I have is whether or not even these changes will require amendments to the infamous Bill C-69, because the process now is you make an application for any pipeline or power line that crosses a provincial or international boundary. You make that application to the Canada Energy Regulator, and the Commission calls a hearing, weighs the evidence, and makes a recommendation to GIC. So now if GIC is making, so Governor and Council, if their cabinet essentially is making that decision at the start of the process, do you need to amend the legislation to enable that to happen? So that's one question. Maybe there's a way through ministerial orders or authority to do that. But I think certainly you will have to look at the system as a whole, and things that people often focus on the approval side of the equation, which is what this bill is focused on. But the other place you see major delays is in the construction side. So yes, you can get approval to build your project, but then you need to go and obtain every single permit required to actually get it operating, right? And so the other part of this that has to go hand in hand is that one review, right? So alignment between the federal process and provincial processes, and having some type of body coordinating the whole process. So this major federal projects office, because what happens now is the regulator, the Canada Energy Regulator, is the only life cycle regulator in Canada. So the team there is very aware of the company's project timelines, and they understand what it means if a decision doesn't come within a certain window. They could lose an entire construction season if they need an ice road to get it done, or it's going through a schoolyard or something, right, where the time window is very short. The rest of government, if you need a permit from Department of Fisheries and Ocean or Transport Canada, often the person reviewing that application is also a policy analyst. So they're writing briefing notes or they're developing policy options. And so they don't always understand that link of timeliness. I think if you bring all of those things together, so putting those components in place, coming up with some type of agreement, and I think there will need to be a written agreement between the federal government and provinces on the one project, one review. But if you can do all that, you can absolutely shorten the timelines.
So to look at how we go forward, I think we can almost take a step back and maybe look at the why that some of these other projects were unsuccessful, and maybe to further explain these different conduits and bodies that are making these decisions or did in the past. So maybe let's start with Northern Gateway. Can you kind of break that down for us on some of the opposition or some of the appeal or concerns by government and the regulator on that file?
Yeah. So this is where projects taking multiple years to get approved is a real challenge, right? Because the social acceptance for this is one that shifted over time. So initially, very exciting project to get from Alberta to the West Coast through a part of BC that is very dependent on a resource economy. So initially it was looking good. But there was Indigenous opposition and then growing opposition from the government of British Columbia. And then with the change in federal government as well, and the desire to, create a new national park and introduce a tanker ban, it just became untenable that there's no way that project could proceed. So, maybe if you got an agreement in 6 months' time, it would have been built, but certainly not over the period it took.
It's interesting, this one specifically as a failed project, I think is worth really taking a look at, especially as, premiers, with the exception of David Eby, look at a corridor that runs to Prince Rupert, why this failed in the past, how it could work now. And, we've heard from the BC government already that they're not pumped about an oil pipeline running to Prince Rupert. But there are other options, and maybe some of this is a little bit subjective, but I mean, we could look at that failed case and say a lot of those problems still exist. Like First Nations, there's still a lot of First Nations opposition. There's still a rainforest there. Like, does it make more sense to maybe increase capacity on Trans Mountain?
Well, you have to remember that Trans Mountain was already expanded.
Yeah.
That was the whole project, right? It was an existing
Yep.
pipeline that was expanded, and you can increase through increased pumping stations and a whole variety of things. There's a way to maximize the output, but the question I have is, where is the opposition in BC actually? So you have an NDP premier who is opposed to a pipeline. Once you get outside of Vancouver and just a little pocket of Vancouver Island, much of British Columbia has similar sentiment to Alberta, right? In terms of people working directly in a resource economy and understanding the benefits of that. So is there a path that gets you to yes through a pipeline that gets you to Prince Rupert? You know, is the current government as focused? Like, I have questions about that rainforest, that park. Was that particular? Like, is there something very special? And I mean, no disrespect, but was there something very special about that part of British Columbia? Or could you protect a different part? We part of British Columbia. We also expanded Trans Mountain through Jasper National Park. So it has been done before, and it can be done again if you want to get it done. There are creative ways. And I think on the Indigenous side, we're seeing all these equity deals. We're seeing real engagement in terms of partnership, in terms of oversight. And so I think if we shift that narrative and actually acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are rights holders and treat them as true partners from the outset, I think that there's a way to make progress and diminish that opposition. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I think you have to approach it with a different mindset than was done 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Can I ask? I just wanted to ask one more question on Prince Rupert, or a northern pipeline, because I remember in government, and Gitane, you and I were in a lot of meetings together like this. The government does this like really easy to understand economic analysis, saying if Alberta had this pipeline completed, it would impact the bottom line like this. And if it had Trans Mountain completed and could export to Asian markets, it would have this impact. If Energy East at the time, when it was still being considered, it would have this economic impact. What is and sorry if you don't know this off the top of your head, what is the economic case for having both Prince Rupert and Trans Mountain at the same time?
Well, because one, as soon as you increase optionality, it decreases the differential. So as soon as you have the ability to sell to places other than the United States, we can typically sell WCS for more money. And we saw that with Trans Mountain coming online. I think it was a $9 lift overnight. So there is that, right? And then also there's the reality that production is tied to takeaway capacity. So if companies know there's more ability to ship oil, then they will produce more. And so there's all of those pieces that fit together. I don't know exactly what the math is, but I think where there's a demand, like, they will want to be able to ship it. And there is still a demand. And we've actually seen, I was reading a study about how China is looking to buy its oil from places other than the United States. And guess what? It's buying it from Canada. And that gets into a whole geopolitical conversation. But I think there is that demand as the churn around the US and their trade policy and domestic policy and foreign policy, all of it is changing. That countries are looking to change their source of supply. So I think there is an opportunity there for Canada.
And of course, your route is shortened just a little bit if you're exporting off the north than you are off the south, right?
Yes, by actually several hours. It's not inconsequential.
Yeah, so maybe just on the Prince Rupert, because I know that the government of Alberta, Minister of Transportation and Economic Corridors is there right now. I believe the Minister of Indigenous Relations. I don't know. I know that they're meeting with industry as well as Indigenous partners. Not sure if the BC government is there. But can you maybe talk about that port exactly? Because to your point, Asia, they're already getting propane shipped from there by rail. Would this, from your understanding of economic corridors and interprovincial trade, would it be a path to least resistance? I mean, we've heard the premier bring up these revitalizing these pre-existing projects. Is it worth revisiting it as its original, or is there things that would have to be done to make this to make the shoe fit?
I think it has to be approached differently. I think that all of the players need to acknowledge that time has passed and that we have evolved as people. And so you need to come at it from a different approach. I think that Indigenous equity is table stakes at this point. So you're going to need to get nations on side. And of course, it is a bit trickier in BC with a lack of treaty, but Trans Mountain did it community by community. So I think there is a way. I think too, the shift that industry needs to make is that the standard cannot be just that there will be no leak, but what is the economic benefit to communities? So shifting that. And I think we've seen a lot of companies get better at that. If you look at LNG Canada and their engagement, they are thinking differently. So there's that dynamic. And I do think it's always more helpful when governments are on side. So can you get mayors along the way? Like if you can't get the provincial government right off the bat, can you get mayors? Can you build a coalition and can you work towards that support? Because Prince Rupert, I think it's actually a whole day sailings time. It cuts off between Canada and Asia. So it can make a big difference in terms of shipping costs. And just think too, from an economic development perspective, what that would do for Northern British Columbia, like all of those pieces are pretty important. So I think it's just a matter of coming at it from not the point of view that this pipeline shall be built, like we deserve this pipeline. It's actually being curious, listening to people's concerns, engaging in conversations and real partnership to get it built.
That's such a important way to look at it, I think, because I do think that there's a lot of Albertans who feel like we deserve a pipeline. Like we are just this
it's our
economic,
right.
Yeah, it's our coast too. We deserve a pipeline. We want to export our resources so that we can benefit the rest of the country. And that has, been a long serving narrative for many premiers of Alberta, no matter your political stripe. How do you think that hurts pipeline projects? Like when it's that kind of rhetoric where it comes in and it's like, we need to build this pipeline. I mean, throughout the Trans Mountain debate, when the NDP was in power in Alberta, that was a huge clash with British Columbia. And obviously, the broader discourse around pipelines really shapes how they're viewed on the ground.
I think that we have to shift the narrative, and I can't take credit for this. My good friend Grant Sprague that we worked with as well, Cheryl, he says, you have to shift the narrative from what Alberta wants to what Canada needs. And we have not been very good at that, right? We almost, when I speak with my colleagues in Central Canada, they're like, you guys are so demanding and you just whine. But we're not. We're trying to get across the message that, in fact, the oil and gas sector is central to Canada's national economy. And this is a conversation I have regularly. You don't have to like it, but you have to acknowledge the fact that the oil sector is about 10% of Canada's GDP. It's hundreds of thousands of jobs all across the country, 40% of which are outside of Alberta. Our crude oil exports are very directly linked to the value of our dollar. Shipping all that crude oil other places makes it cheaper for us to buy things from other countries. Like all of this is linked together. And so you need to first acknowledge the fundamentals of the economy. Again, you don't have to like it, but you need to acknowledge it. And then you also have to acknowledge that we have some pretty big fiscal challenges in Canada at the moment. We have a productivity challenge. We are facing an uphill journey here on the economic front. And the quickest way to lift our economy is to export more resources. Yes, we want to move up the value chain, but we're already good at this. And so the more we can get to market, and also acknowledge that we have what the world needs. People need fuel and they need food, and we have a lot of both. And so if you can shift that and take advantage of this moment where I think people are looking to move away from the United States, become more self-sufficient, independent, trade with other nations, to have that conversation. And again, the message I think that Premier Notley was very good at sharing is it's not an either or on energy and the environment, right? You can do both, but we also need to be realistic about those timelines, right? Like there's no magic switch where we switch from a fossil-based energy system to a green energy system overnight. And we also need to acknowledge that mining for critical minerals has a pretty big environmental footprint as well, a different one than mining for bitumen, but still an environmental impact. And so be honest about those conversations.
Yeah, what does that look like for projects like Energy East? I mean, you're traveling more across Canada. You need more stakeholders aligned. Is that one able to come back in any form, or was that kind of a project that, unlike what you've broken down for Northern Gateway, has no opportunity for revival?
I think there it's really a conversation around national energy security. Like if I were sitting in Ontario or Quebec right now, I'd be pretty nervous about if our relationship with the US really deteriorates and the Americans decide they're going to stop pipelines, our oil from flowing around the Great Lakes and back up into Canada. In Ontario, you'd be in trouble pretty quickly, right? And so I think that's where the conversation gets important. It's also just frankly challenging. There's a reason why pipelines run north-south and not west-east. And you have to look at geology and geography. The continental shield is some very big, old, hard rock. It's very hard to drill through. Also, the economics of going through the US, there's many more offtake points. So there's lots more industry and population bases. So that's a conversation where you'd have to reposition that pipeline is what is the national benefit? So could you, in building that pipeline, like was done with Trans Mountain, you run some fiber optic cable with the pipeline, you also run, say, broadband. So all of the communities along the way that don't currently have access to high-speed internet or may not even have reliable cell service, can you make it more of a nation building project? And then I think it starts to get interesting, but the pure economics of it are challenging. And I think, then you just put in tolling rates and everything else. So I think you need to make it really a national conversation about what is the benefit and do we want to be self-sufficient? And that's where it becomes way more attractive.
Where do you think our miss has been on that? Because, like you said, talking to your friends out east, like you're so demanding. Where is our miss, either from who is leading the nation and able to have that conversation, or industry leading, or just general communication about this national energy process we need to go through, or strategy?
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that not everybody sees the benefits, right? It's a little bit like, we're starting from a point where we know this is a wonderful idea and we can't fathom why other people wouldn't see it. So we should not repeat the mistakes of the past. Like maybe file your application in French in Quebec as opposed to in English. Maybe when you're determining the route of the pipeline, actually think through the economic benefit for the communities along the way. Maybe don't have your terminal at a place where belugas have their babies. Like really think this through strategically and make the case. Like I think it's like anything, you're developing a business case. And so what is the benefit to the people along the way? And I think that we can do that if we're more sophisticated than we have been in the past.
Gitane, I've heard this on prior podcasts you've been on and from other people in the industry and actually from Daniel Smith too, that we have this like chicken and egg problem. And I like it described as that because we've had in Canada so far, like proponents come forward first and say, we'd like to build these projects. And then, they work through it and they, have their environmental assessments done. And then politicians get to weigh in on the projects. And that hasn't worked. And now we have the First Ministers meeting coming to the table saying, we'd all like to work together and sort of like build a corridor. And then maybe a proponent will come to the table. Which of these could work, or is there other options?
I think it's an all of the above. I think the reality is the conditions are such in Canada now that it would be hard for a proponent to come forward. I think it would be hard for a corporation to go to their shareholders and say, this company lost so many billions on this pipeline and another company lost billions, but we're going to do it anyways. So I think you do need the political paradigm to shift to actually be supportive, to change the regulatory system. And like I said before, moving that political decision point up to the beginning, I think will be very, very helpful. I also think you do need some written agreement. It has to be written down somewhere that the provinces and federal government are going to work together. And I ideally would like to see that taken out of the election cycle. So could you reach agreement, sign something, and say, we're not going to touch it for 10 years? Right? I think that would be very helpful because it takes a while to build these projects. And so you want that degree of certainty. I think too, setting the conditions for Indigenous engagement will be key. And I think that's where somewhere governments can lead the way. You could issue guidance, for example, on what meaningful consultation looks like so people understand where the bar is, and you could have that guidance vetted by the Supreme Court before it is finalized. So people would feel a greater degree of certainty that they actually knew what was expected. You could also have governments, as opposed to each government department having its own Crown consultation team. Maybe they're regionally based. Maybe pick a department, maybe it's Crown and Indigenous Relations. They have a team in multiple teams in each province, and those are the people that hold the relationship with nations. And then you add the expertise of the Canada Energy Regulator, the Impact Assessment Agency, or whatever to that, so that those conversations are starting from a place of trust and respect as opposed to having to build them every time. And even with all of that, I expect that industry will want government to have skin in the game. They will want government to be financially invested in a positive outcome because they've been more than once bitten, twice shy. So they'll want to see that government is serious about actually getting these projects built.
When you say that,
go ahead, Erika.
When you say that, do you mean skin in the game as an investment, or the, legislative changes to create that environment? Like, what do you think would give that investor confidence back from after all these failed projects?
Some type of financial either equity, tax cuts, an agreement to purchase barrels, whatever it is, to demonstrate that you are focused on the upside, that you have something to lose. So the legislative change, I don't think will be enough. I think they'll also want some degree of financial investment to make sure that the government is committed to seeing the project through.
Gitane, you mentioned First Nations consultation, which has been a big part of like every project, whether it's gone through or whether it's failed. And that like duty to consult, that free, prior, and informed consent that we saw in UNDRIP has become like pretty central to conversations around not just pipelines, but any major national infrastructure projects. Obviously, every project and every nation is unique, but based on what we've seen so far in projects that have gone ahead and then the work that Trans Mountain did, what do you think are the takeaways on working with First Nations to get these projects done?
I think that we could look to Northwest Territories as a model where they require, before they'll even consider issuing a license, the proponent needs to take education on the nations, on the treaty, and understand history. And then they need to reach an impact benefit agreement with each nation. And only once they have that all documented will government even consider their application. So I think that that's a reasonable bar because, like any community, Indigenous peoples want to see benefit and they want to be a part of it. So I think that's going to be key. And I go back to defining what meaningful consultation is. People are really focused on the UN Declaration on free, prior, and informed consent, but there's many things in there which are challenging to resource development, like in terms of sites of significance and architectural finds and a whole variety of things. And so I know that people focus on that one element, and the federal government has said repeatedly that consent is not a veto. But I think you have to look at it holistically, and you just have to acknowledge these are rights holders. Treaty is law. We need to uphold the honor of the crown. And so to engage in respectful conversation, because meaningful consultation, is not 100% accommodation, but you need to understand what that actually looks like and go about it in a respectful way. It's not a check the box exercise. It's an actual conversation about how you can get to yes and get something built.
And there has to be some takeaways from Trans Mountain on that, right? Because as the project went ahead, the courts found that meaningful consultation wasn't done and it was all done over again. And it is one of the reasons that Trans Mountain is in service, the expansion is in service today.
Well, there's a couple of things there. The court found that meaningful consultation had not been done on the marine side, right? So it was really that element of once the barrels hit the water and how that would impact nations there. So really understanding from the beginning who is impacted and who needs to be consulted is key. And then I think the key difference there is that you have to give credit to Ian Anderson. He went community by community and he met with every chief and he invested the time required as CEO to develop those respectful relationships, and the chiefs knew that they could call him. Then another thing I think that was central is the government in its approval required an Indigenous advisory committee be set up, both on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and on Line 3. So there actually was a table for Indigenous nations to come together with government, with the regulator, and have conversations about the issues that matter to them. And as a result, the regulator shifted its approach, whereby when I was with the regulator, we were taking Indigenous monitors out with us on inspections. So they could identify, sites of significance, trees that were culturally important, and talk about what was important to them so we could protect those things. And then also they could take that information back to their communities. And because they're a member of the community, then their community members had greater faith in what they were being told. And when there was an emergency, we included them. So I think it's that, like, you really just have to shift the paradigm and be respectful, develop real partnerships, and then you can get stuff done.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you're breaking it down from some of not just the holistic paradigm shift, but also some of the tactical things. I also heard that you gave full credit to Ian and not to Justin Trudeau or Rachel Notley for that pipeline. And I appreciate, no, I'm just kidding. I just can't give credit. Cheryl's always like, but we built a pipeline. So I got to push where I can push back. One of the things that I found optimistic by this new he's not new anymore. We're just not going to say he's new. But Prime Minister Carney is that he said he's going to take the permitting and project approval from 5 years to 2. Is that political, speech for we're going to try and speed it up? Or is that actually realistic? Like, is he using that as a political play, or could we actually see that come to fruition if some of the changes you've highlighted and the proper consultation was put in place?
Well, it is possible to
Okay.
expedite the approval process because, like I say, you're moving that political decision point up to the beginning,
Mhm.
right? And that's often where you see delays is that the recommendation of the commission goes to the government for approval, and then an election happens, or it's summer recess, or they need additional time for crown consultation, or whatever it is, and then that decision point gets pushed out. So I think moving that up will be key for sure. And then I think if you can set some bar on Indigenous consultation, that'll also help to speed things up. But then it's also, like I say, it's on the construction side. People are focused on the shortening the approval window. We also need to do our homework on making sure that the construction period moves as quickly as possible, as is safe and protects the environment and communities and everything else. But attention needs to be paid to that too, or you can languish for years in trying to get something built.
Before we let you go, Gitane, we wanted to sort of like ask you to put your old deputy minister hat on, where a big part of your job was giving advice to elected officials. So if you think about that role and you think about the people who are in power now, namely, Mark Carney, Danielle Smith, David Eby, as some of the biggest players in pipeline development, what advice do you have to those political leaders today?
Yeah. So public servants, fearless advice and loyal implementation. And I remember briefing a particular premier, and that premier said to me, Jatan, you're not making me feel very good. And I said, Premier, it's not my job to make you feel good. It's my job to tell you the truth.
I feel like you said that to a few premiers.
Probably more than one. So in that vein, I would tell people to put their big boy or big girl pants on. This is a really important moment for Canada, and I understand that you need to be partisan to win elections, but now is the time to put that aside and actually think about what's best for the nation. And I think that what is best for Alberta, what is best for BC, and what is best for Canada, all those things are aligned, right? It does not make any sense to only have one customer for name your product, not just crude oil exports. And so we need to take control of our own destiny. And that means we're going to have to make some hard decisions. And, I learned over my time at the regulator that if you land on a decision where everyone's a little bit mad at you, you're probably in the right place, right? Because the job of a regulator, at least at the Canada Energy Regulator, is you regulate in the public interest, which means you're balancing economic, energy, environmental, Indigenous, landowner, all of the rights and trying to figure out where's the best place to land. And so I think that people are going to have to make some hard decisions, but they have to figure out how to work together. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't advocate for your jurisdiction and try to get maximum benefit. But also, if we want to remain united as a country, then we need to demonstrate that we can work. And I know, like, there's Albertans that would like to separate. You think it's hard to get a pipeline built to a Canadian coast. Imagine if you're landlocked, like, good luck to you. But we do have to demonstrate that we can work together. And so this is a way to do that. It's a way to figure out, okay, what do we have in common? Just like, there's been times when you can reach across the aisle and be, okay, like, we don't agree on 14 things, but there is one thing on this list we can agree on. And if we agree we want to diversify our markets, we agree we want to grow our economy, then let's be realistic about how to do that.
Yeah. So just on that, I mean, G7 is coming up right away. What are you looking for from not just from how Canada presents itself, but that international conversation of economic diversification and partnerships?
I think it's a really consequential meeting. And I think it's also going to be really tricky because you have at least one world leader who is very thin-skinned. Any appearance that the whole world is ganging up on President Trump, then it will not go well, or it might go well in the moment, and then he'll get on Air Force One and he'll post on True
Tweet.
Social about who knows what, right? So I think that, there's a lot of groundwork that has to be laid in advance of that. And I suspect that's why Carney and Trump are texting each other. There's a lot of work done behind the scenes to try to create the conditions for success. But I think the world has to walk this balance between wanting to bring the US back into the tent, because if you look at the countries who are members of the G7, it is far more in their interest to have the US remain engaged and remain a superpower than to move to a more multipolar world where you've got China and then some alliance between Russia and Iran and North Korea. So they'll want to keep the US at the table, but how do you do that in a way where you stay true to your values and what's good to your economy, as opposed to just catering to a long list of demands? It's a real opportunity for Canada to demonstrate leadership on the world stage and to show that other alliances can and do work, and you can have respectful conversations. I certainly give the Prime Minister credit for not negotiating in public. I think that is smart. to hold his powder, have quiet conversations. And I think if you can set it up in a way that Trump feels he's won something, then you'll probably have a much more successful summit than if you feel. So you remember that picture from the last time with Angela Merkel, like staring him down and wagging her finger? That's not what he'll want this time.
He's already fighting with Elon, so he's like, he'll just come in happy and needing
Elon
some friends.
apologized, though, didn't you
I
hear?
saw
He said he went
that on
too
X.
far.
He went too far.
Mhm,
I was
mhm.
like, that's where I'm like, what was that behind the scenes conversation?
No kidding. Gitane, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for taking the time to be here. Just to recap, Gitane De Silva, former Deputy Minister in the Government of Alberta, former head of the Canada Energy Regulator, and Gitane continues to offer fearless advice with her own strategic consulting firm. So thanks for taking the time today, Gitane.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I feel like Gitane covered so much that we wanted to in the broader scope of this conversation and really broke it down in a way that I think people across Canada can digest as like what's in it for me. But I have been sitting with this since the very beginning of like when you had mentioned bitumen bubble, it triggered like when I worked for Redford. And that was the term that was used in 2012. And I've just been like gyrating and being like bitumen bubble.
You know
'cause
what's
that
so
was
funny?
yeah.
I have a clip. I'm going to drop it in. I have this clip of me when I'm a news anchor talking about Alison Redford's bitumen bubble. Good evening and thanks for watching. Tom is off tonight. Alberta Premier Alison Redford taking to the airwaves last night with a warning about cutbacks in the upcoming provincial budget.
There is a deputy minister that still works there that I know was the chief economist at the time that I swear was the one that came up with it. So just funny. I was like, again, I mean, we love our alliteration. So I shouldn't maybe be triggered by it, but just try to explain it to people. I remember, well, we thought that that was a way to explain it, but really not.
Memorable.
Yes, it was. But yeah, no, I mean, I worked in a time both with Redford. I worked for Smith on, I mean, that was more of a fight with Ottawa. Now it's kind of changing. I feel like that's, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of these conversations with Mark Carney right now, with Kenny's approach to all of this. But yeah, like walk me through when you had kind of your campaign, because as I know, you always tell me that you were the people that got a pipeline built.
Well, and like, granted, like the government bought it and built the pipeline. But
Mhm.
I do think that a lot of the work that Rachel Notley did laid the groundwork and informed the public in a way that allowed the government to step in and buy the pipeline. When we first started campaigning for Trans Mountain, so whatever year that was, 2016 or 2017, there was like 4 in 10, like when we were talking about cross Canada, 4 in 10 support for a pipeline to Tidewater, for expanding Trans Mountain specifically. And rather than like campaign in Alberta and tell Albertans how awesome a pipeline would be and talk about how everybody's standing in the way of building a pipeline, Rachel went to centers that really were opposed to building a pipeline and told them about, first, like 2 things. One, that Alberta had just introduced a world leading, for an energy producing jurisdiction, a world leading climate plan. That, you know, we had this emissions cap and we had, you know, phased out coal and we had all these basically things that would support protecting the environment while continuing resource development in Alberta. And then secondly, she explained to people, which Albertans take for granted that the rest of Canada knows this, but she explained to people how much of a driver Alberta's industry was to Canada's GDP. And she said this by saying, there's not a road, there's not a bridge, there's not a bus lane in this country that doesn't owe something to Alberta's energy industry. And as she did that to rooms across the country, and as she did that to smaller boardrooms of influential people in different markets, people started to nod their heads and say like, oh yeah, we kind of get it now. Like, we kind of get it. And like, I'm not saying Rachel deserves all the credit for moving public opinion, but on top of her own personal tour, we ran a massive ad campaign, in one instance, actually projecting the ads onto the side of the building that the Liberals had their Christmas party in. Like a massive ad campaign across the country, including in British Columbia. And I do think that moved the needle.
What was do you remember the slogan?
Keep Canada working.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, do you know what's interesting is, so less of a direct campaign, but what we were battling in 2011 to 2014 with Redford was the international reputation. And I think everyone still is. I know, I mean, given Alison Redford's experience and her international credibility, different than Rachel, who was doing more of the Keep Canada Working campaign, we were like balancing we have all these projects that are coming. There's interest in them, but we're still known as tar sands. And so I feel like a lot of the focus was how do you change that perception? And it probably all fed into each other. And even Kenny picking up some of that with the Canadian Energy War Room, or if you agree with that or not. But I think, again, that perception was still there that we were dirty tar sands. And I remember celebrities coming and like doing documentaries or posting about it. And so that perception of her traveling to the States was huge part of our administration, and getting that some of those MOUs with other countries outside of the US. It's so funny to think that that's over a decade ago, and some of these things are still happening, or still being finessed, or trying to get them across the goal line. And so, yeah, I can't remember if we did a specific campaign on it, but yeah, we were dealing with both the bitumen bubble and the tar sands was like really the either taglines we were trying to make happen or not.
I remember one of them.
Yeah. What do you have for advice? Like if we were fast forwarding and you were briefing
I was going to ask you.
Well, I asked you first. Haha. What would you give either like to any of the premiers or the prime minister? I mean, going into G7 would be, I think there's a lot on the line for everyone right now.
I think part of the piece for jurisdictions outside of Alberta, so like basically every other province in Canada, Saskatchewan to some degree, but I think Saskatchewan gets it. Part of the problem is that no one really sees the risk of doing nothing. And so it's like, what happens if we don't? What happens to me and my economy and my job if we don't build these projects, if we don't build another pipeline to Tidewater, if we don't build a national energy corridor? What happens? What's the risk of doing nothing? And for a long time, that hasn't really permeated the conversation. Like people don't see a risk. They think we have what we need right now and we don't need anything else. And yeah, there can be promises of benefits, but they don't see it as tangible to their daily lives. And so my advice would be to those premiers that are talking to their own voters in their own jurisdictions is like really start to frame this as there being a risk to doing nothing. And the conversation around Trump and the conversation about energy and economic security has certainly helped that. Like all of a sudden we have this front and center risk. But as that sort of conversation and as that threat hopefully continues to become less front and center, people start to forget about it. And so we need to keep reminding people that there is a risk to doing nothing.
As you were saying that, I was almost just like, I think that's Carney who has to do that. I mean, I think he is, but because Alberta and Saskatchewan can say it, but they've been saying it for over a decade. The way I think it will authentically land is that has to be the impact for Canada. And then to your point, I think that the premiers, if I'm looking at like how I would advise Premier Smith, I'm almost just like do a feasibility study on current proposals or pathways to Tidewater behind the scenes and then pick one. Because I mean, when we're looking at elections and I'm not saying ignore the other two, but look at like what your barriers are, what your challenges are, do it like a SWOT analysis essentially on these projects.
Because but that's what you've criticized the NDP for doing, right? Like the NDP picked one. The NDP picked one, the one that was most feasible. They picked Trans Mountain. And so the other projects didn't go ahead.
I only am critical that you guys take full credit when the projects were like.
No, you say we killed all the other ones.
Are you saying me as in Erika Barudi's or me as in the Conservatives?
No, you specifically.
Okay. Well, no, I see things still explore it. But when I look at, say, Wab Kinew, who's very interested in the port action, it's also like, okay, but what else would that cost to be able to get it? What would function from exporting LNG or like oil and gas? What does that look like for reiteration of Energy East? I'm not saying like, I think that right now it just sounds spray and pray to all of these projects, and then prioritize them, because what I'm thinking of is politically going into an election. And I know that Gitane said, that we should get out of those election cycles, and I don't disagree with that. But when in the reality of right now, if you're going to make movement, you want to have one that's actually like, which one do we push extra hard on while the other ones are still working behind the scenes? And I do think it's through Prince Rupert, given the fact that there's already a pathway, given the fact that it's the closest and cuts down time, and we have Asia already interested. So I guess, I still criticize you, and I will continue to, because you killed everything else and just did government bailouts to make it happen.
Me personally.
Better one than none. However, I still think those other ones are just not feasible as fast. And I don't think they'll happen in 2 years. And I don't think we're going to have the regulatory or business case in the same way. Like, I think we need to build one Canada to be able to show corporations and industry that we're actually serious. And I think right now there's so much apprehension from industry to put money down when they've been out billions before. So I think it's the certainty of what government's going to do to support business and make these true environments to operate. My briefing note or my verbal briefing would be a lot faster than that, because I wouldn't have you criticizing what I was saying.
Okay, I have one last piece of advice for Danielle Smith in this, that she has to talk to people outside of Alberta in the way that people outside of Alberta talk.
Like, know your audience kind of thing?
Yeah, and like there is certain language that Albertans love. And we talked about it with Gitane. Like, Albertans believe that we deserve a pipeline to Tidewater. We believe that we deserve access to Canada's coast. Like, whether that is true or justified, I don't think that's how people in BC feel. And so thinking about what persuades that audience and what makes them willing to take on the risk that is involved with any national infrastructure project, thinking about that language and using that not only outside, but like on any opportunity where she has a national stage, thinking about who she's talking to and who she actually needs to persuade while maintaining her political points in Alberta.
I like that. I have a parting piece for our good friend, Premier Eby then.
Okay.
I would say follow the path of the propane export and like go through all of those communities, because I think that if you went to Prince Rupert, had these conversations, there's far more support by the communities that could benefit from it than the political play of votes on the island. So we're both saying be like more political and know your audience, or be less political and know your audience.
Look, we found agreement. That's our show for today. Please do us a favor. If you are watching this on YouTube right now, please hit that subscribe button. If you're listening in the audio version, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And as you know, we drop every Thursday at 5 a.m. And if you can't get enough of us, go to Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok to get some fill midweek.
Bye.
Bye.
The Discourse is hosted by Cheryl Oates and Erika Barudis. Follow on Instagram at The Discourse Pod. Subscribe to The Discourse on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.